continue our study today of the Lord's discipleship teachings of Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. This is our third lesson, and let me just remind you that these teachings are challenging and they are very convicting. They cause us to examine our own level of personal discipleship commitment, and we have to walk up to the rigorous and rigid discipleship standards of the Lord Jesus, and we have to ask ourselves, how do I measure up to these specifications? You recall that large crowds were following Jesus. Evidently, many of them considered themselves part of the Jesus movement, yet they were at best only superficial followers. They didn't understand the meaning of true discipleship. They were uninformed. And so Jesus turned to them, he looked them in the eye, and he clarified his conditions for discipleship. Most loving thing he could have done for these people. And he informed them that hard decisions were involved in discipleship, and these are decisions which demand prayer and soul searching and determination. You recall that in a previous lesson, Jesus spoke of the disciple and his or her relationship, priorities, and loyalties. One's love and loyalty for Jesus must be supremely above his or her love and loyalty for closest earthly relations. And you say, well, why is that? Because we understand one's closest earthly relations can be a source of greatest challenge to a continuing discipleship commitment. There is a tendency to compromise, and I think we'll all struggle with this. There's a tendency to compromise on commitment in order to accommodate the wishes and desires of loved ones. Here, Jesus said, is an issue that one who would become and remain his disciple must settle. Last lesson, we looked at the subject of cross bearing. Jesus said, whoever does not carry his own cross cannot be my disciple. Literally, is not able to go on being my disciple. You recall that crosses were not for carrying, crosses were instruments of death. And Jesus associated cross bearing with denial of self. This is denial of ego, putting down of ego and personal agenda. It's the denial of one's claim and disposition to be his or her own man or woman. It is a denial or a dethronement of one's human reasoning and a commitment to obey Jesus, even when such continuation of commitment flies in the face of human reasoning and logic. So this is about continuing to follow Jesus even when we don't understand. In this lesson, we pick up with Luke chapter 14 and verse 28, and the particular subject I'm calling it the informed decision of discipleship. Jesus gave two illustrations that emphasize the necessity for careful and deliberate consideration of the decision to begin to publicly follow Jesus as a disciple. Obviously, Jesus pointed out and he understood this is something that one cannot do on a whim. I think I've shared this with you before. We don't just wake up one day and think, well, okay, I'm going to start following Jesus. There's more to it than that. So, the informed decision of discipleship, I'm going to read Luke chapter 14, verses 28 through 32. Again, Jesus was addressing the crowds of superficial followers, and he's clarifying the conditions, the specifications of discipleship. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it, enough to complete the project? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. In other words, a person who starts on a project and they're not able to see it through to completion, they become an object of ridicule. Verse 31, another illustration. Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, two kings are going to throw down, they're going to rumble. What king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider? I'm stressing these words. First sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000. Okay, so we got some 2-to-1 odds here. Am I willing? Am I willing to start out on this course? Am I willing, how far am I willing to go? Or else, Jesus continued, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. Now, first of all, in exercise and observation, you see some similar words here in these two illustrations, don't you? And I think much of the lesson is involved in these words. The tower builder, a wise tower builder, would first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it. A thoughtful and wise king will first sit down and consider the circumstances of going to battle. Okay, so as we begin to look at these verses and try to get a handle on what Jesus was teaching, first thing I want to point out is that the Bible knows nothing of secret discipleship. Rather, it assumes a public identification with Jesus Christ. Additionally, Jesus did not teach a part-time discipleship. It's not something that one can put on like a shirt and then wear it on Sunday morning. When Sunday's done, take it back off again. And the Lord didn't teach that at all. The Lord taught a whatever it takes level of commitment to Him. Whatever it takes, Lord, to be closer to you, the song says, whatever it takes to please you, that's what I'm willing to do. And the Lord, He warned against impulsiveness. I suppose that we've all, at times in our lives, we've made impulsive decisions. We have spoken impulsively without first giving due thought and consideration to our words. Okay, what the Lord is teaching, one thing He's teaching us is that the discipleship decision cannot be an impulsive decision. This is not something one can do on a whim. These illustrations are about the cost of counting or accounting the cost of discipleship. I want to say a few words about this. The subject of counting the cost is misunderstood, it's misapplied. The idea some have is that God's people should never attempt anything for the Lord. God's people, His churches, they should never attempt anything for the Lord for which they do not already have all resources in hand or available for completing the project. Now, the terminology they use is they say, well, this to operate this way is simply being good stewards of God's resources. There's a real problem with this interpretation and application of counting the cost, and the problem has to do with it does not harmonize, it does not align with the teaching of the need to exercise faith. For example, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6, you're familiar with this verse, that without faith it is impossible to please God. Without the exercise of faith, it's impossible to please Him, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him, or those who diligently seek Him. There will always be an element of faith involved in our service to the Lord. Following the Lord, serving Him, is going to mean that there are things behind us, perhaps that we have to walk away from, and in our opinion, they're undone, and they may be, but we have to walk away from and continue following Jesus, and we have to trust Him to take care of the issues that we leave undone behind us, or it can be a matter of, there are some things out ahead of me. I don't know how they're going to work out. I don't know how things will come together, but I do know what the Lord would have me to do right now, and thus I'm going to step forward, maybe on wobbly knees. Faith is not the elimination of fear, right? So maybe on wobbly knees, and I'm going to make my step one step at a time, and I'm going to trust the Lord to work out ahead of me, um, the things that are going to have to be brought together and worked out. So the Lord will see to it that there's an element of faith. There's some area that we have to exercise faith in Him when we step out to serve Him. Another thing I think is important I'll share with you here is that counting the cost of discipleship. Now, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to know everything, every challenge, every obstacle, um, every struggle we may have in going forward and serving the Lord. At best, we're going to know and understand that there will be these things, and it's in light of these things that we say, okay, Lord, I understand that I will be challenged, but I know what you want me to do, and I'm going to trust you to be with me, to work things out and give me the strength I need at the time that I need it. Perhaps I should add as well. Somebody, a wise man, once said, faith, commitment is not the end of challenges. It really is. It is the beginning. Wise man. All right. So the folly of a rash tower builder. We read verses 28 and 30 of Luke chapter 14. Understand, towers were not uncommon in Palestine. Tower building involved expense, effort. Additionally, a tower was a conspicuous object with which the builder's name would be associated for a long time. So you understand, an unfinished tower would be a standing monument to its builder's thoughtlessness and lack of dedication and determination. A wise and thoughtful person, Jesus just working from common sense here and common practice. A wise and thoughtful person would first sit down and calculate the cost of the project before he or she began it. And some important matters would have to be settled. Okay, expense, energy, and effort are going to be required of me to see this project through to completion. In other words, this is going to cost me something. If I start this project, to finish it, it is going to cost me something. Now, will discipleship cost us? Is there a cost involved? Yes, there is. There are costs involved. What is important for us to understand is that obeying the Lord, making Him our Lord and following Him, will never cost us anything of true value. One would have to answer the question, if I start this project, am I willing to dedicate all my resources to see it through to a completion? Now, there are some interesting words here that just wanted to share a few things with you. This word calculate in your King James Bible, it's count. It's the Greek word psephizo. All right. The verb was associated with the process of voting. In fact, it was the term that described that the activity of voting. Now, understand, among the Greeks, one cast his or her vote, they used a pebble. Normally it would be a different colored pebble. So, it would be like, okay, if you're voting Democrat, you have a white pebble. If you're voting Republican, you have a black pebble. Okay, so one vote with a pebble, and votes were counted. This will help us tremendously. Votes were counted how? One pebble at a time. In other words, somebody had to sit down and take one pebble at a time. And yeah, it was kind of a tedious process, but I think you would understand the idea here of of time and working things through and going through things and calculating, okay? The word complete, verse 28, in the King James, again, it's a little different. It's finished. It's the Greek word apartismos. We would say it this way, a complete completion. When when I worked in the heavy equipment field, we would repair a tractor and engine, overhaul a tractor, and one of the hardest things of a job was when you get to the end of the job and you're making sure that the job is complete, it's thorough, all things are done correctly. All right. And so the terminology that we used for a job correctly done was to put a good kill on the job. Okay, so you've checked it out, you've put it in a working environment, and you have finished out the job thoroughly and completely. That's the idea here behind this word, completing the tower. You started a project that you have completed, you've taken it all the way to completion, and it is a thorough job. So the vital issues here are what? Well, number one, if I begin this project, this is the tower builder reasoning things through. If I begin this project, or we could say if I start down this course, am I prepared and willing to do whatever it takes to finish it out, to take it all the way? In other words, okay, the questions would be involved. Is this worth my all? How much is too much, and how far is too far? I think here's the bottom line. If I start this project, if I start down this track, is the thorough completion of it, seeing it through all the way to the end, is it worth it? This matter of value has to be settled. Is this worth it? Okay, so one who began to build but then abandoned and failed to finish the project would become an object of ridicule for those who observed his or her foolishness. Others would not take them seriously, and again, the incomplete project would be a public monument of the impulsive builder's lack of thought and dedication and determination. Now that brings us then to the second illustration, the folly of a thoughtless king. The Lord used an illustration of a king going to battle. His enemy has 20,000 soldiers. He, the first king, he may have 10,000 soldiers. He has at least that many, but it may be he only wants to commit that many or less. A wise king, again, common sense, a wise king would first sit down and consider some important matters before he set out for the battle. This word consider, bulesetai, to deliberate within oneself. I kind of like there's an old English translation. Actually, it predates the King James version. It's Tyndale's version. And first sit down and casteth in his mind. All right. But here's the idea: to sit down and to deliberate. There's somebody going through the motions, working things through. Deliberate within him or herself. What would be the issues? Am I willing to commit all my forces? Am I willing to commit all my resources to the battle? In other words, is this battle, if I enter into this, if I initiate this, is it worth my all? Is it worth committing all my resources? Or we say it this way, common terminology, is this a hill I'm prepared to die on? A thoughtless king would send his forces to battle and discover that he didn't have the resources or the dedication to achieve victory. His actions would move his adversary to mobilize and move against him, and what he would have to do is that he would have to send and ask for terms of peace while the other king was still far away. Now, interesting question here. In such a case, who would dictate the terms of peace? The foolish king, the thoughtless king, or his enemy? Well, obviously, the king, the enemy, would be in the position of power. He would be the one calling the shots. And so the foolish king, and I'm going to use some terminology here several times throughout this lesson and the next lesson. The foolish king would have to make a deal with the devil. Okay, so here's something that happens in discipleship service. Somebody starts out and they've gone down this course and they've not thought it through, and a challenge comes up. They don't want to just discontinue following the Lord altogether, right? And so what happens? Well, they're going to make a compromise, going to end up making a deal with the devil. So I'll go this far in my discipleship, but I come to a point that it's too far, and there's more here than I'm willing to commit myself and my resources, and so I will compromise and I will stop right at this point. What do we have here? Jesus taught the necessity of an informed decision, didn't he? A believer who would become a disciple of Jesus Christ should carefully consider the realities and demands of discipleship service before he or she publicly starts down that road, as we say. So the issues that have to be thought out and settled is following Jesus closely worth it? And am I willing to do whatever it takes to obey him? So, in other words, questions are involved. How far is too far? How much is too much? And I think that when we can answer and we can say, well, this point is too far, or this amount of my resources is too much. Probably then, when we say that, we're not ready to start down that course of discipleship. Failure to think it through, to think things through, often results in some form of compromise. As I said, what happens? A child of God has to make a deal with the devil. Compromise. Okay, so we have these two illustrations that Jesus warned potential disciples. He warned them against impulsiveness. He said, you really need to sit down and thoroughly think this through, pray, and do some soul searching. That brings us to verse 33. We'll enter into this in this lesson. The disciple and his or her possessions. Jesus said, so then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. Oh, wow, that's pretty tough. Now, literally, can't be my disciple, cannot go on being, or is not being able to go on being my disciple who does not give up all his or her own possessions. Now, want us to note this. The Lord's primary focus in these teachings that we're studying was not so much on the matter of starting out publicly as his disciple, but rather that the emphasis or the focus was on that of staying the course once you have started. Jesus was concerned that one who starts doesn't quit, or worse yet, does not compromise in following him. Well, what's this teaching about? This business about our possessions. The teaching is about our attitude towards our stuff or our possessions, our belongings. Jesus said, so then, or literally, therefore, in this same way, and this points back to the two illustrations that he just gave. Here's some things Jesus said a disciple must do. Now, the question for us to ask and answer, did Jesus mean one who would be his disciple must give up all his or her own personal possessions? In other words, does possession of personal property preclude one from being a disciple of Jesus Christ? No, Jesus did not tell us that we must get rid of all of our stuff. This teaching rather is about our attitude towards our things. Understand, a disciple can have possessions, but he or she must not be possessed by their possessions. So let me explain this a little bit. A child of God can be possessed by his or her possessions. How does this work? One makes decisions relative to spiritual service, relative to discipleship, makes decisions based on the criterion of the impact that obedience will have on his or her continuing to keep or to hold on, to clutch their possessions. In other words, decisions involved, a decision, maybe a tough decision, and the Lord is calling us to walk away from things. Okay, there are people, and I think we all struggle here, especially in our materialistic world. Okay, there are people who say, I will follow Jesus up to the point that I don't have to give up. I don't have to put at risk any of my belongings. So what we're talking about here is that one's things can control his or her spiritual decisions, right? So these things become an impediment then. The desire, the need to cling, to hold on to them, they become an impediment to following the Lord. And again, involved here is this idea of making a deal with the devil. I'm going to compromise, right? I've got my stuff. I really like it, and I think it's fine to like our stuff and to enjoy it. We should enjoy it. God gives it to us. But the problem here is when we allow our stuff to become idols and to get in our way of continuing to follow the Lord. Okay? So have your stuff, enjoy your stuff, but we can't let that come between us and obedience to the Lord. And whether we keep our stuff or have to walk away from it cannot enter into the decision to serve the Lord. You understand, many children of God make their decisions as far as their Christian service. They make their decisions based upon economic factors or based upon the factor of keeping my stuff or whatever. And so what ends up happening again is what I call this compromised form of discipleship, which really renders one ineffective in his or her testimony. Jesus taught that a believer who would follow him closely must settle the matter of relative value. One must conclude that the value of being a disciple of Jesus Christ is so supremely above the combined value of all of his or her possessions that should faithfulness and obedience to his will require one walk away from his or her things, that decision is already made. Okay, Lord. So, in other words, I've got my things. You've given them to me to enjoy. They're really yours. And so I'm going to use them. I'm going to enjoy them. But I understand that you might ask me to walk away. And if you do, I'll do that. I've already made that decision. So again, we're talking about an attitude here. So I'm going to give you an example of this before we close out today. And it's a matter of spiritual accounting. I want you to remember that terminology. Spiritual accounting. A disciple should do some spiritual accounting. The example I want to give you is that of the Apostle Paul or Saul of Tarsus, and this is Philippians chapter 3, latter portion of verse 4, reading through verse 8. I'll read these for you. Paul speaking to the church of Philippi, and there were some issues about Judaistic teachers came in behind him, and they put a lot of stress on the flesh man and pedigree and things like that. Okay, and so basically Paul said that's nothing, right? But he said, if anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I more. In other words, if anybody has a reason, a right to brag from a fleshly standpoint, he said, I can brag. He said, circumcised the 8th day of the nation of Israel. In other words, he had observant parents, right? Of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was the aristocratic tribe of Israel. Paul said, Paul, a Hebrew, I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. As to the law Pharisee, in other words, his religion wasn't a nominal religious preference. As to zeal, persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness which is in the law, and I think that law as defined by the rabbis and Pharisees, Paul said, found blameless. But, love this, whatever things were gained to me, those I have counted as loss for Christ's sake. More than that, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered or allowed the loss of all things and count them but rubbish. The King James Version says dung. You know what that is. I count them rubbish or dung so that I may win Christ. Okay, well, let's talk about this just a little bit. And here's another teaching, by the way, that's misunderstood. People say that, well, Paul was saying that when the Lord called him to become a Christian, Paul took a big hit. He took a big loss, all right? And so, it's like, okay, I'm going to serve you, Lord, but it's going to be a downer because it's going to cost me that. That's not what Paul said at all. In fact, just the opposite is true when we understand his words. What he was saying is that if he would have refused to become obedient to the Lord's call, he would have become a big loser. What he's saying here, what he's telling us, is he became a big winner when he made that decision to obey Jesus Christ. In the Jewish economy of things, Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul, he was racially and religiously elite. His racial pedigree and his religious accomplishments within the framework of the Jews' religion were advantages to him. They were gained. And these pretty much guaranteed him things like prestige, position, and power and possessions in his life. Got all those P's going on there, don't I? Though Saul was on the fast track to success, a study of his pre-conversion life reveals that he was a very frustrated man. You say, well, what was his problem? He was bound in a legalistic, joyless, frustrating, and hypocritical religion. And you'll always find that with legalistic people. They're frustrated. They're very religious, but they're not happy people. All right, so we know the story in Acts chapter 9. Jesus calls Saul to become a Christian, to become a disciple of himself. Saul could not play both sides. In his case, he couldn't keep his religion and its advantages and be a Christian, be a disciple of Jesus Christ. So what did he do? He did some spiritual accounting. And he laid things side by side. Here are my accomplishments and my advantages. But here on the other side of the ledger, here are all the things that I could have if I will obey Jesus, walk with him. I'll have his approval of my life. I'll have peace and joy. So he laid these things all out. And what he determined, this was his conclusion, that a close relationship with Jesus was of incomparably greater value than all his stuff, all of his advantages, all of his possessions. So what did he do? He walked away. He let go of all of his stuff. And what he got in return is he got joy and he got freedom and he got peace. So this idea of spiritual accounting, this is prominent in this study today. In fact, maybe I could have called it, rather than the informed decision of discipleship, which is true, we could have called this section the need for spiritual accounting, because that's certainly involved. When we make Jesus the Lord of our stuff, he has our hearts and our affections. Would you agree? When we make him the Lord, the King of all we have, he has our all. He has us. And we become free to follow him wherever he leads. So here are some things that Jesus taught one who would be his disciple, his obedient, faithful, and consistent disciple must do. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Again, I realize that there are some hard things here, but some things that if we will do them, if we will settle some issues, we will experience the joy of true discipleship, and we will become effective disciples indeed. We will make a difference. The Lord will use our lives to make a difference, in the lives of those around us. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.